license and registration, now.
Officer, may I ask what violation I committed?
I said, give me your document.
Here's my license and registration. I'm recording for my protection and do not consent to a vehicle search.
Turn that off. Step out of the
I'm
vehicle.
cooperating, but I assert my rights. Please note this is under duress.
The highway at night is a place of anonymity, a river of red taillights and white beams cutting through the American darkness. It is a place where we feel safe inside our steel cages, insulated from the world by glass and speed. We believe that if we follow the rules, if we stay within the painted lines, the chaos of the world cannot touch us. But on a Tuesday evening at 7:23 p.m., on a stretch of Highway 95 that smells of asphalt and pine, that illusion of safety was about to be shattered by the flicker of a blue strobe light. Consider the mathematics of the moment. The black sedan was traveling at 58 miles per hour. The posted limit was 55, 3 miles per hour, the width of a walking pace. The difference between a rounding error and a reason to ruin a life. Inside the cabin of the modest Honda Accord, the air was still, filled only with the low hum of the tires on the pavement and the soft murmur of NPR on the radio. The driver was a man named David Richardson. To the eyes of the predator watching from the median, Richardson was nothing more than a silhouette, a demographic variable to be processed, a ticket to be written, or perhaps something more lucrative to be seized. But the predator did not know he was stalking a dragon. When the emergency lights erupted in the rearview mirror, painting the interior of the Honda in violent washes of blue and red, Richardson did not panic. He felt that familiar, primal spike of adrenaline, the chemical taste of fear that every citizen feels when the state demands their attention. But he suppressed it instantly with the cold logic of a master chess player. He checked his speedometer, 58. He checked his location, mile marker 104. He checked his mirrors. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew the statutes. He knew the case law. He knew the precise calibration requirements for radar guns and the constitutional thresholds for probable cause. David Richardson was 52 years old, an assistant attorney general who had spent 3 decades building a reputation as a relentless prosecutor of the very specific type of corruption that was about to walk up to his window. He was a man who lived in the fine print of the Fourth Amendment. He drove a car that whispered middle-class invisibility, worn-in seats and a trunk full of gym clothes, but his mind was a weapon of mass destruction against the abuse of power. He signaled. He pulled to the shoulder. The gravel crunched beneath his tires, a gritty sound that signaled the end of freedom and the beginning of detention. Behind him, Officer Marcus Williams sat in his cruiser, the engine idling, the dashboard camera silently capturing the prologue to his own professional funeral. Williams saw a black car. He saw a quota that needed filling. He saw an opportunity to exert dominance over a lonely stretch of road. In 12 years of wearing the badge, Williams had stopped 847 cars. He had developed a sixth sense for weakness, a bully's intuition for who would fold and who would fight. He looked at the Honda Accord and saw prey. He did not see the invisible armor of the law that surrounded it. Richardson killed the engine. The silence that rushed into the car was heavy, pressurized. He placed his keys on the dashboard, a deliberate, practiced motion. He lowered the window. He placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, fingers spread, palms open. He was not just complying, he was performing a ritual of survival that he had taught to hundreds of young attorneys and terrified community members. He sat in the dark, waiting for the footsteps. Can you hear them? The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the pavement, the creak of the utility belt, the sound of authority approaching, with a predetermined narrative in its head. Officer Williams approached the vehicle not with the caution of a public servant, but with the swagger of an occupier. His hand drifted to his hip, resting on the grip of his service weapon. It was a subtle gesture, perhaps unconscious, but to the trained eye of the man waiting in the driver's seat, it was a screaming siren of escalation. There was no threat here. There was no erratic driving, no fleeing suspect, no report of a weapon. There was only a middle-aged man in a Honda who had driven the speed of a brisk walk over an arbitrary limit. And yet, the officer approached with his hand on the mechanism of death. Inside the car, Richardson's eyes tracked the movement in the side mirror. He saw the hand on the gun. He cataloged it. He filed it away in the steel trap of his memory alongside the time, the weather conditions, and the traffic flow. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. With a single swipe, he activated the voice recorder. He did not hold it up like a shield. He simply let it rest, a silent stenographer ready to capture every syllable of the injustice about to unfold. The air in the car grew colder as the window let in the night. The smell of exhaust fumes and the ozone tang of the strobe lights drifted in. Richardson took a breath. He slowed his heart rate. He prepared his voice to be flat, neutral, devoid of the fear that the officer expected to hear. He was about to be subjected to a play he had read 1,000 times, but this time, he wasn't reading the script from the safety of his office. He was the main character. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, blinding him for a split second. A dazzling white interrogation. It swept over his face, searching for dilated pupils, searching for fear, searching for a reason to escalate. It swept over the empty passenger seat, the clean floorboards, the mundane reality of a man commuting home. Then, the face of Officer Williams appeared in the window, framed by the night and the flashing lights. His eyes were hard, expecting submission, expecting a plea for mercy. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a reason for the stop. He did not ask if there was an emergency. He simply stared down at the man behind the wheel, already convinced of his guilt, already writing the ending of this encounter in his mind. But endings are tricky things. They rarely go according to plan when you mistake a wolf for a sheep. The silence stretched between them, a 3-second eternity where two worlds collided. On one side, the arrogance of unchecked authority, backed by a gun and a badge. On the other, the quiet, terrifying certainty of the law, armed with a recording device and a lifetime of patience. "License and registration," the officer commanded, his voice flat, bored, dangerous. And in that moment, on the side of Highway 95, the trap was sprung. But Officer Williams didn't realize that he wasn't the one holding the lever. He was the one standing on the trap door. The officer's hand rested on the grip of his service weapon. It was a subtle detail, perhaps invisible to the average motorist paralyzed by the strobe light panic of a traffic stop. But to David Richardson, it was a screaming siren of intent. Standard procedure for a minor speeding violation, 58 and a 55, did not dictate weapon readiness. There was no threat here. There was only a Honda Accord, a middle-aged man in business casual, and a calm Tuesday evening. Yet, Officer Williams approached the window with the kinetic tension of a soldier entering a combat zone. He had already decided that the man inside the car was not a citizen to be served, but a suspect to be subdued. Richardson watched the approach in his side mirror, his pulse steady, his mind shifting from driver to prosecutor. He noted the unlatched holster. He noted the aggressive posture. He rolled the window down, not all the way, just enough to pass documents, creating a physical barrier to the intrusion. When the demand for the license came, it wasn't a request. It was an order barked with the expectation of trembling compliance. Richardson didn't tremble. Instead, he asked the question that every citizen has the right to ask, yet few dare to voice. He requested the reason for the stop. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The officer's jaw tightened. The question was treated not as a legal inquiry, but as an act of defiance. The demand for documents was repeated, louder this time, stripping away any veneer of professional courtesy. Richardson moved with deliberate slowness. He broadcast his actions, narrating the movement of his hand toward the glove compartment, then to his wallet. He was performing a high-stakes choreography, where a single sudden twitch could be interpreted as a threat, justifying a lethal response. He handed over the plastic rectangle of his identity. Williams took the license. He held it up to the beam of his flashlight, turning it over, scrutinizing the hologram, comparing the photo to the man in the seat. He looked for a flaw. He looked for a tremor in the hands. He looked for the smell of alcohol or the haze of narcotics. There was nothing. The license was valid, the registration was current, the insurance was premium. 4 minutes passed. Richardson sat in the silence, watching the officer stare at a valid piece of plastic. 4 minutes is an eternity when you are being detained on the side of a highway. It is enough time to question your reality, to feel the creeping heat of indignation. But Richardson forced his mind to remain cold. He was counting the seconds. He was cataloging the behavior. This was no longer a traffic stop. It was a fishing expedition. Williams turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser. He did not return quickly. He sat in his vehicle, the radio handset pressed to his mouth. Richardson watched through the rearview mirror. 12 minutes. For 12 minutes, the officer sat there. He wasn't running a background check. That takes seconds. He wasn't calling in the plate. The body language was casual, the conversation leisurely. Williams was weaponizing time. He was letting the driver stew, waiting for the anxiety to build, waiting for Richardson to crack, to get out of the car, to shout, to give him the excuse he's so clearly desperate for. But Richardson didn't crack. He sat like a statue, the recording app on his phone silently capturing the dead air of a civil rights violation in progress. When Williams finally returned, the script shifted from administrative delay to physical intimidation. The command came to step out of the vehicle. Richardson asked why. He asked the logical question: why is it necessary to exit a vehicle for a 3-mile-per-hour speeding ticket? The officer's response was a fabrication so clumsy it was almost insulting. He claimed he needed to conduct a safety inspection. It was a lie. State police protocols do not authorize roadside safety inspections without probable cause. And there was no cause here. The car was pristine, but Richardson knew the calculus of the street. You fight the battle in the courtroom, not on the asphalt. To refuse the order now was to invite violence. He stepped out into the cold night air. Immediately, he was ordered to the hood of his own car. Spread your legs, hands on the metal. The humiliation was public and performative. Cars whizzed by in the left lane, their headlights illuminating the scene. A black man bent over a police cruiser, being treated like a felon while wearing the clothes of a litigator. Williams's hands were rough. The pat-down was aggressive, invasive, lingering on pockets, sliding down legs, checking the inside of shoes. It was a search for a weapon that didn't exist, and drugs that weren't there. It was a physical assertion of dominance designed to provoke a reaction. Richardson felt the officer's breath, smelled the stale coffee and the aggression, but he remained limp, compliant, verbally noting his objection for the recording, but offering no physical resistance. The search yielded nothing but a wallet, keys, and a cell phone. A reasonable officer would have stopped there. A reasonable officer would have realized the mistake, issued the citation, and retreated. But Williams was past the point of reason. He was chasing a phantom. He demanded to search the vehicle. Richardson refused. He spoke the words clearly, leveling his gaze at the officer. He did not consent to a search. He asserted his Fourth Amendment rights. The refusal hit Williams like a physical blow. His demeanor snapped from professional annoyance to open hostility. He grabbed Richardson's wrist. He saw the phone. He realized the recording was active. The demand to turn it off was desperate, a panic reflex. Richardson refused that too. He stood his ground on the pavement, stating his right to record a public official in a public space. The air crackled with the potential for violence. Williams called for backup. The cavalry arrived in the form of flashing lights and 2 more officers, Torres and Kim. They stepped into a scene that was already spiraling. Williams pulled them aside, whispering a narrative of suspicion and non-compliance, painting a picture of a dangerous suspect. But the recording device didn't blink. It heard the lies. It heard the fabrication of nervousness. It heard the officer digging his own grave with every whispered falsehood. Then came the demand to empty the pockets onto the hood. Richardson complied. He laid out the mundane artifacts of his life: the breath mints, the keys, the leather wallet, and then the business cards. Williams picked one up. He read it aloud, his voice stumbling slightly as the words registered. Assistant Attorney General, Criminal Division, Civil Rights Unit. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrified. The 3 officers exchanged glances. The reality of the situation hung in the air like smoke. They hadn't just stopped a civilian, they had illegally detained, frisked, and harassed one of the highest-ranking prosecutors in the state, a man whose specific job description was to hunt down bad cops. But pride is a blinding thing. Instead of retreating, instead of apologizing and ending the disaster, Williams doubled down. He accused the card of being fake. He demanded proof. He was a gambler who had lost the house but was still trying to bet the car. Richardson reached into his wallet and produced the credentials. The gold shield, the government ID, the courthouse security pass. There was no ambiguity now. The wolf had realized too late that he had broken his teeth on a lion. Yet, Williams, driven by an ego that could not accept defeat, declared that he didn't care. He declared that the search would continue. He opened the driver's door and began to tear the car apart, unaware that with every floor mat he lifted, with every glove box he rifled through, he wasn't finding evidence. He was manufacturing the shackles that would eventually bind his own wrists. This is the anatomy of a slow-motion catastrophe. Most people, when they realize they have stepped off a cliff, instinctively try to grab a branch, a root, anything to stop the fall. But Officer Williams did not grab a branch. He decided that if he flapped his arms hard enough, gravity would simply cease to apply to him. He had just been handed the credentials of a man who could dismantle his career with a single phone call. Yet the officer stood by the open door of the Honda Accord, driven by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and humiliated pride. He dove into the vehicle. This was no longer a search for contraband. It was a frantic, sweating hunt for justification. Williams began to rifle through the interior with a jagged, nervous energy that betrayed his panic. He ripped the floor mats from their anchors, tossing them onto the gravel shoulder. He unlatched the glove compartment for a second time, his fingers scrabbling against the plastic, hoping against hope to find a forgotten joint, an unregistered weapon, a single pill, anything that would retroactively validate the violation of a prosecutor's civil rights. Richardson stood on the roadside, the asphalt cooling under the night sky, watching his own Fourth Amendment rights being shredded in real time. He did not yell. He did not interfere. He simply held his phone, the digital eye unblinking, recording the sound of his privacy being invaded. He watched Officer Williams slide his hands under the seats, fingers probing the dark crevices where lost coins and dust bunnies collect, searching for a crime that did not exist. Officer Torres moved to the perimeter, her body language screaming discomfort. She positioned herself between the rampant officer and the silent prosecutor, a human shield against a lawsuit she knew was inevitable. She saw the spiral. She saw the madness of it. In the deep POV of the moment, one can almost hear her internal scream, the realization that she was witnessing a career suicide pact she hadn't signed up for. She asked Richardson quietly if he wanted to make a call. It was a lifeline, a subtle hint that this could end if he just reached out to someone in power. But Richardson declined. Why stop the enemy when he is so busy destroying himself? The search moved to the trunk. If the interior search was invasive, this was merely pathetic. Williams demanded the trunk be popped, and Richardson announced to the recording that this was happening under duress, without consent. The trunk lid rose, revealing the mundane cargo of a suburban life: jumper cables, a spare tire, a gym bag. Williams unzipped the bag. He rummaged through the sweaty workout clothes of an assistant attorney general. He checked the pockets of gym shorts. He squeezed the fabric of t-shirts. For 47 minutes, traffic on Highway 95 roared past, oblivious drivers heading home to their families, unaware that on the shoulder, a federal case was being built out of nothing but hubris and dirty laundry. 47 minutes of detention. 47 minutes of a man's life stolen because an officer couldn't admit he was wrong. Finally, the search ran dry. There was nothing left to overturn. The vehicle was clean. The trunk was clean. The air was thick with the silent realization of total failure. Williams stood by the open trunk, breathless and empty-handed. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold, creeping dread of consequence. Officer Torres approached him, her voice low, suggesting they wrap it up. It was an exit ramp, a chance to apologize, issue a warning, and pray for mercy. But the ego is a stubborn captain. It will go down with the ship. Williams refused to leave without a trophy. He returned to his patrol car, not to release Richardson, but to write a citation. He sat in the glow of his dashboard lights and committed his final error, the one that would strip away any defense of good faith. He wrote a ticket for speeding, but he didn't write down the 3 miles per hour he had initially claimed. He wrote 8. He falsified the speed to make the stop appear legitimate. A paper lie to cover a physical intimidation. He handed the slip of paper to Richardson with a sneer, a final assertion of dominance. He believed this piece of carbon paper was his shield. He was wrong. It was his confession. Richardson took the citation. He did not argue the speed. He looked at the badge number on the paper, then looked up at the man. He asked for the full name. Williams hesitated. The request hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. He tried to deflect, pointing to the badge number on the ticket. Richardson insisted. A citizen has the right to know the identity of the state calling them to account. Grudgingly, furiously, the officer spoke his name, Marcus James Williams. Badge 4487. Richardson repeated it for the recording. He captured the name, the badge, the time, and the location. He then turned to Officer Torres and Officer Kim, requesting their information as well. Torres apologized. It was a rare moment of humanity in an hour of cruelty. She whispered that this wasn't how they usually did things, but the apology was recorded too, an admission that the standard had been breached. Richardson got back into his car. He did not speed away. He did not peel out in anger. He checked his mirrors, signaled, and merged safely back onto the highway, driving exactly at the speed limit. The drive home was silent, but his mind was loud. The prosecutor was no longer a driver. He was a shark smelling blood in the water. He arrived at his quiet suburban home, the sanctuary he had been trying to reach for an hour. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't pour a drink to soothe his nerves. He went straight to his study. The blue light of his computer monitor illuminated his face as he uploaded the audio files to the cloud. He created backups on 3 different servers. Then, he sat in the stillness of his house and began to transcribe. He typed out every word, every grunt of exertion from the officer, every lie told to dispatch, every violation of the Constitution. He wasn't just writing notes. He was drafting the architectural blueprints of a legal demolition. He noted the timestamps. He cross-referenced the statutes. He compiled the evidence with the cold, dispassionate precision of a surgeon preparing to cut out a tumor. Down at the station, Officer Williams was likely joking with his colleagues, spinning a tale of a difficult driver, convincing himself that the badge would protect him as it always had. He had no idea that in a quiet room 10 miles away, the man he had forced to spread his legs on the hood of a Honda was currently typing the first lines of an indictment that would not just end a career, but expose a decade of systemic rot. The pivot had occurred. The victim had become the hunter, and the hunt would be merciless. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought the cold, hard light of scrutiny. David Richardson walked into the office of Chief Deputy Attorney General Sandra Martinez, not as a subordinate seeking advice, but as a prosecutor delivering a smoking gun. The room was soundproofed, designed to keep state secrets, but as Richardson played the audio recording from his phone, the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Martinez sat motionless. She had spent decades in the trenches of the legal system, yet the audio, 47 minutes of calculated humiliation, stripped away the veneer of law and order. She didn't hear a traffic stop. She heard a predator toying with prey, unaware that the prey was a lion in disguise. By the afternoon, the machinery of justice, usually a rusting, grinding gear, began to spin with terrifying speed. Martinez didn't just file a complaint, she lit a fuse. The files hit the desk of the FBI's Civil Rights Division before the sun went down. Simultaneously, State Internal Affairs investigator Detective Lisa Chen began to pull the thread. She didn't look at the emotions, she looked at the math, and the math was damning. She pulled Officer Marcus Williams' service record for the last 12 years. The data sprawled across her screens like a map of systemic infection. 847 traffic stops. 623 involved minority drivers. These weren't random anomalies. In a district with balanced demographics, the statistical probability of such a skew was virtually zero. It was deliberate. It was industrial. Detective Chen saw the pattern of a man who treated the Fourth Amendment not as a rule, but as a suggestion. Williams wasn't policing a highway. He was farming a specific demographic for sport. When the FBI stepped in, led by Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, the scope of the war expanded. They didn't just want the traffic stop, they wanted the man's soul. They subpoenaed financial records and personal communications. What they found in the digital ether was a toxic sludge of arrogance and bigotry. Williams wasn't acting alone. He was part of a watch list, an informal, encrypted network of 12 officers across 3 departments who traded tips on how to target successful minority drivers. They shared photos of luxury cars like trophies from a safari. They bragged about attitude adjustments and celebrated the fear they instilled in doctors, lawyers, and business owners who dared to drive nice cars while having the wrong skin color. The investigation revealed that Williams, earning a modest state salary, was depositing cash bricks into his personal accounts, money that smelled of bribes, or perhaps the proceeds of unspoken thefts during those 47-minute searches. The corruption wasn't a bug in the system. For these men, it was a feature. But the conspirators made a fatal miscalculation. They sensed the walls closing in, and they reverted to the tactics of the street. Richardson began to receive the messages. A dead rat was left on the windshield of his car. A crude, medieval warning. Anonymous calls flooded his office. Heavy breathing and veiled threats about what happens to prosecutors who turn on the blue line. His home address appeared on dark web forums frequented by aggrieved officers. They thought this would break him. They thought fear would silence the man who had sat calmly while they searched his gym bag. They were wrong. Richardson didn't cower. He documented. Every threat, every dead rat, every hang-up call was cataloged, tagged, and added to the federal file. The intimidation tactics didn't stop the investigation. They accelerated it. They turned a civil rights case into a federal racketeering indictment. By trying to scare a witness, they had handed the FBI the keys to a RICO case. The hunters were now frantically trying to board up the windows, unaware the house was already on fire. The end came not with a whimper, but with the synchronized breach of battering rams. 8 months after the stop, the raids began at dawn. It was a coordinated strike across 3 counties. Officer Williams, who had stood so tall and imperious on the side of Highway 95, was pulled from his home in handcuffs, the flashing lights of the federal convoy reflecting in the eyes of his watching neighbors. He wasn't charged with a mistake. He was charged with conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. He wasn't alone. 6 other officers were swept up in the initial dragnet. Officer Kim, who had lied to investigators to protect the Brotherhood, found that his loyalty had purchased him a seat at the defense table as a co-conspirator. The blue wall of silence didn't just crack, it shattered under the weight of federal indictments. Officers who had stood on the periphery, watching the corruption for years, suddenly found their tongues, rushing to cut deals, pouring out stories of a culture where the Constitution was treated as an obstacle to be circumvented. The legal discovery process was a bloodbath. Emails surfaced showing supervisors had ignored red flags for a decade. Performance reviews praised Williams for his high activity, while ignoring the racial disparity of his stats. The department had incentivized the violation of civil rights, paying overtime to men who were actively hunting innocent citizens. 14 defendants. Over 300 years of potential prison time combined. The charges were heavy, suffocating, and undeniable. Williams' defense attorney tried to argue that the stops were geographically incidental, a desperate Hail Mary that was intercepted by the cold, hard data of the FBI's location tracking. Williams hadn't stuck to his patrol zones. He had hunted. He had gone out of his way, driving miles off his beat to find the prey he preferred. As the trial loomed, the bravado of the roadside vanished. The swagger was gone. One by one, the conspirators began to plead guilty, desperate to salvage a shred of their lives. But Williams, blinded by his own hubris, refused. He went to trial, believing a jury would see a hero. Instead, they saw a tyrant. The verdict was a hammer blow, guilty on all counts. The judge, looking down at the man who had terrorized a highway for a decade, sentenced Marcus Williams to 18 years in federal prison. The system that Williams believed he owned had finally turned its gaze upon him, and it did not blink. Richardson sat in the back of the courtroom as the sentence was read. He didn't smile, he didn't cheer. He watched the bailiff lead Williams away, a man stripped of his badge, his gun, and his freedom. The legal war was over. The battlefield was cleared. But as the heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed, a lingering question hung in the air, heavier than the verdict itself. How many others had been stopped on that highway who didn't have a law degree? How many lives had been ruined in silence because they didn't know how to fight back? The war was won, but the ghosts of the past remained. The silence that follows a verdict is different from the silence of an empty room. It is heavy, pressurized. a vacuum where the air has been sucked out by the sheer weight of consequence. When the gavel struck the wood, finalizing the 18-year sentence for Marcus Williams, it didn't just echo in the courtroom, it reverberated through the entire architecture of the state's law enforcement. But the end of the trial was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of the reckoning, the long, slow fade of the adrenaline, leaving behind only the stark reality of what had been broken and what could never truly be fixed. The civil litigation that followed was less a battle and more of a surrender. The state agencies, desperate to staunch the bleeding of their public reputation, offered settlements that reached into the millions. They paid for the humiliation of the surgeon, the harassment of the business owners, and the violation of David Richardson. But checks written by taxpayers do not wash away the sins of the badge. The money was an admission of guilt, a bureaucratic apology for a culture that had allowed a predator to roam Highway 95 with a license to hunt. For the department, the purge was absolute. The watch list was dismantled, its members scattered to the winds, their careers pulverized under the crushing weight of federal indictments. The supervisors who had looked the other way, who had signed off on the overtime and ignored the racial skew of the statistics, found themselves clearing out their desks, their pensions jeopardized, their legacies reduced to cautionary footnotes in police reform manuals. The blue wall of silence hadn't just cracked. It had been demolished by a single 47-minute audio recording. But what of the victor? David Richardson returned to his quiet suburban life, but the quiet had changed. He drove the same Honda Accord, lived in the same modest house, and drove the same route home from the office. Yet, every time he saw the flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror, even if they were speeding past him to an emergency elsewhere, his heart would hammer against his ribs. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. He had won the legal war, but he had lost the innocence of his daily routine. He was no longer just a prosecutor. He was a symbol, a reluctant icon of civil resistance. He received letters from across the country, handwritten notes from strangers who had been stopped, searched, and humiliated, but who lacked the legal vocabulary to fight back. They wrote to him as if he were a saint, thanking him for validating their trauma. Richardson read every single one, and with every letter, the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a tragedy. He realized that his survival was an anomaly. He had survived because he knew the penal code better than the officer holding the gun. He had survived because he had the presence of mind to hit record. He had survived because of who he was. And that was the haunting thought that kept him awake at night. If he had been a carpenter, a school teacher, or a nurse, if he had been anyone other than an assistant attorney general with 30 years of prosecutorial experience, that night on the side of the road would have ended very differently. The drugs could have been planted. The resistance charge could have stuck. The plea deal would have been forced. The ruin would have been total. Justice, he realized, had not been blind that night. It had been lucky. And then there was Marcus Williams. The transition from hunter to prey is a psychological break that few recover from. Williams, stripped of the uniform that gave him his armor, was processed into the federal penitentiary system not as an officer of the law, but as inmate number 4487. A grim irony, as it matched the badge number he had so reluctantly given up. Inside the concrete belly of the prison, the dynamics of power were inverted. The man who had demanded total submission was now subject to the absolute authority of others. He who had conducted invasive, humiliation-driven searches was now the one standing with his legs spread, enduring the cold, impersonal hands of the guards. Reports filtered out that Williams struggled to adapt. The arrogance that had fueled him on the highway had no currency in a federal cell block. He was isolated, protected from the general population, but imprisoned by his own history. The 18 years stretching before him were not just a punishment for a traffic stop. They were a penance for a decade of stolen dignity. He had spent his career believing that the law was a weapon he wielded, only to find that it was a cage, and he had locked himself inside. The legacy of the case rippled outward, rewriting training protocols in 3 states. The Richardson Standard became shorthand for the burden of proof required to extend a traffic stop. Dash cams and body cams became non-negotiable. The darkness where officers like Williams used to operate was being flooded with light. But as the years passed, the visceral shock of the scandal faded into the dry text of legal precedents. The story became a lecture in law schools, a case study in academies. Yet, the final echo of this story isn't found in the law books or the prison logs. It is found on the shoulder of Highway 95 in the quiet dark of a Tuesday evening. The road is still there. The cars still rush by, oblivious to the history beneath their tires. The terrifying truth that lingers when the screen goes black is not that the system worked. It is that the system failed, and it took a miraculous alignment of circumstance to fix it. We celebrate David Richardson because he fought back, but we mourn the reality that he had to fight it all. Justice is not a natural state of the world. It is an act of will, a grind, a constant exhausting vigil. And as you drive down your own dark highway tonight, watching the headlights cut through the gloom, you are left with the uneasy question that hovered over the courtroom when the final sentence was read. If they came for a man who knew the law better than they did, what makes you think they won't come for you? The recording stops, but the road goes on.